Hello, I'm Commander Alastair Cooper. Welcome to this episode of the Australian Naval History video and podcast series. The series is produced at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, in partnership with the Australian Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society, Navy's Sea Power Centre, and the Submarine Institute. Thank you for joining us. On the morning of the 19th of September 1940, the light cruiser HMAS Adelaide approached Noumea harbour in New Caledonia. It was the start of a little-known but hugely successful example of gunboat diplomacy that helped ensure the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia were not threatened by a potentially hostile power. In this episode, we will discuss the pivotal role played by HMAS Adelaide in helping Free French forces assume control of New Caledonia. I'm joined by three people who will tell us the story. Vice Admiral Peter Jones, whose book Australia's Argonauts in part discusses this incident and the life of Adelaide's commanding officer, Captain Harry Showers. Mr. Peter Shannon, a retired diplomat and former ambassador. During his distinguished career, he served in New Caledonia and has written about this incident. And Commander Greg Swinden, who has written the definitive history of the cruiser Adelaide. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. First off, Peter Jones, can you describe the situation in the war at this stage and also why New Caledonia was important?
Okay, so the war was at that stage against Germany and Italy. Japan hadn't ended the war at that stage. And so from a maritime perspective, it was that Germany had commenced a trade war. They were putting into commission up to 10 auxiliary cruisers, or raiders as they became known. And so during 1940, some of these ships started to enter the Indian Ocean and also the Pacific. And the first of their victims, the Niagara, was mined off New Zealand in May of that year. From the Australian Navy perspective, they'd established a Coast Watch network in Northern Australia and also in the Solomons and New Guinea. One eye to this German threat, but also in the longer term, potentially against Japan. Some of the ships had gone as part of that global maritime campaign to the Mediterranean. So HMAS Sydney was there, the Scrap Iron Flotilla was there. Around Australia coast, the role really was to protect the vital convoys against the raider menace. Adelaide was the east coast cruiser. Canberra was on the west coast, and towards the end of the year, Perth was heading off to the Mediterranean to relieve the Sydney. From a military perspective, New Caledonia was important, as you indicated, about trade, but also it had globally significant deposits of chromium and nickel, which were used in armaments manufacture.
Peter Shannon, on the 22nd of June 1940, France fell, and in the ensuing months, French possessions around the globe were forced to choose to pledge allegiance either to the Vichy regime or to the Free French. Can you explain what was happening in the Pacific?
Yes, thank you, Alastair. And could I just make a slight clarification on your introduction in that I actually haven't written anything on this subject, but I've had a long-standing interest in it, not least of which through my wife, who was born in New Caledonia and has had connections to the Johnston family, and I'll sort of mention that in the course of my presentation. Yes, it was a complicated situation. New Caledonia didn't hear of the fall of, the armistice of Vichy until it heard it on Australian radio, and it was subsequently confirmed on the 23rd of June, the day after. So it's intriguing that they were listening to the radio and heard the mother country having fallen. The governor at that time was a gentleman called Georges Pellissier. People say a relatively undistinguished fellow, a time server. He was surrounded by a group of military types. His deputy, with whom he didn't get on, Andre Bayadel, his sentiments and loyalties were a little bit ambivalent. There was a General Council, which was the sort of an advisory body for the local people that was operating at the time. And the day after they heard officially, on the 24th of June, it issued a declaration to say that it would side with the British. But at that stage, Pelissier seemed to signal that he would support the General Council's view. We don't quite know what his own personal sentiments were, but nonetheless he was under pressure, presumably from the Vichy authorities in France, and on the 29th of July gazetted the Vichy constitution. So I guess that meant, in a sense, that so far as he was concerned, New Caledonia was aligning with Vichy. However, that was immediately pushed back by the local people, and Pelissier then became concerned about a popular uprising, so he quietened down. Things, I guess, bubbled along until towards the end of August, when a warship arrived, presumably at the request of the Vichy authorities and the sort of naval commands of the France in the Pacific, and that was the Dumont de Ville, captained by Toussaint de Quievrecourt, a complicated name, and we'll talk a bit about him in the course of our presentation. New Hebrides was a different kettle of fish. It was a condominium. That's to say sovereignty was shared between Britain and France, so there was no opportunity really for the French representatives to act unilaterally if they had wanted to, but in fact the French resident commissioner, Henri Sauteau, was quite personally committed to the Free French cause. And in fact, on the 18th of July, they declared, so far as they had the right to, because it was under the tutelage of two governments, itself for Free French. French Polynesia was a different situation. The authorities there, their sentiment was more Free French, and they declared French Polynesia Free French on the 3rd of September. In New Caledonia, the British side of the condominium was the resident commissioner was a fellow called Richard Blandy. He reported to the British High Commissioner for the Western Pacific, who had a sort of an overriding authority, and he was Harry Luke, and both of those names will come up in the course of our presentations. Just to give you a little picture of what it was like, perhaps while I'm scene setting, if that suits you, Alastair. In Canberra at the time, Robert Menzies had been his government installed in 1939. At that stage, in the early 40s, and don't forget they were only 3 months out of the darkest hour of May 1940. Robert Menzies, I think, was the Minister for Defence at that stage, if I'm not mistaken. His a war cabinet had been established, and the Secretary of the War Cabinet was Frederick Shannon, and they were all meeting in East Block. Those of you in Canberra will know where that is, where the National Archives is at the present time. In External Affairs, the head of External Affairs was Colonel Hodgson, and the Minister for External Affairs was John McEwen. So they were the key personalities in Canberra. But we must remember, as we talk about this story, that there were dramatic events occurring in Canberra. On the 13th of August, there was the air crash at Fairbairn Airport, where 3 cabinet ministers were killed. So that was a disturbing element, leading Robert Menzies then to declare an election on the 21st of September. So that was all background noise to the events we're going to talk about.
How did the Australian and British authorities react to the events in New Caledonia?
How did they react? Well, cautiously and carefully, and superficially ambivalent, I would say. So far as Australia was concerned, there were a number of considerations. Firstly, not to act precipitously, so the Japanese might be provoked. Peter alluded to the fact that the nickel deposits there were quite important in the manufacture of steel in Japan and for armaments, so there was an important nickel trade there. Japan had an active consulate in Noumea at the time, so there was concern about that because of the possible knock-on effect in Dutch East Indies. There was a worry about capacity if there had been resistance in New Caledonia and Australia decided to intervene. Did we have the immediate capacity to deal with it? Another factor. And the third was, I think, an overriding view, like the British had, about until the situation with the Vichy regime settled down, not to completely break the ties. Now, we've got to remember, at this stage, there were a number of countries in the French Empire who were declaring themselves for the Free French, but there were one or two countries which weren't, and we know subsequently in September the British fleet ran into difficulties off Dakar, for example. So that was a strategic consideration. Robert Menzies described this in a speech in January 1941, the British position, and put it in those terms. Now, the Australian position mirrored that. We had our own calculations. We just simply didn't sign off on what the British were doing. We had our own calculations. As I say, did we have the wherewithal to intervene? Worried about provoking the Japanese, and it suited us just to wait and see, to walk down both sides of the street for the moment. So that was basically the orientation. Now, the situation changed in the course of, from the middle of August onwards, as our information became better, and that was one of the big problems. We didn't have too much information.
Okay, thank you. Greg Swinden, the British suggested to the Australian government that they might send the cruiser Adelaide to New Caledonia. Can you describe Adelaide and why she was selected for the mission?
Well, the reason she was selected is pretty simple. She was pretty much the only ship of the right size that we had available at the time. As Peter's mentioned, we had a number of our cruisers over in the Mediterranean or in the Red Sea or on convoy escort duties. Our scrap iron flotilla, the destroyers, were in the Mediterranean as well, and many of our other ships were already involved in tasks. Adelaide was on the east coast. She was a 6-inch cruiser, so she had six 6-inch guns. They were not modern weapons. She was an older ship, laid down during World War I and launched in the early 1920s. But she did have 6 6-inch guns, which was quite significant. She had a crew of about 400, and so she was available to go. She could stand up to the French warships that were in the region, mainly frigates with armed with a 5-inch gun, although they were quite modern, rapid-firing weapons. So she was available. She had the firepower to deal with any potential enemy, noting Peter's also mentioned the German raiders were active in the area as well. She had a crew of over 400, so if there was a need to put a landing party ashore to act as naval infantry, then that could be done, unlike sending a smaller vessel where denuding that number of personnel from the ship would make the ship no longer viable. And she really was the only choice, but more than a little bit old, but more than capable of still doing the job.
Okay. Peter Jones, the commanding officer of Adelaide was Captain Harry Showers, member of the famous first class to graduate from the Royal Australian Naval College. What sort of naval officer was he?
Yes, so he commissioned Adelaide on the day that Poland ended the war, actually, after her modernisation. As you said, he was part of that 1913 entry with John Collins and Harold Farnham, who we've heard about in earlier episodes. During World War I, he had quite an eventful service. He was on board HMS Glorious during the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight. He was on K-22, a submarine that was one of a number of K-class submarines that were in collisions in fog coming out of Rosyth. He, in fact, played a bit of a leading light in saving one of the sailors from a flooded compartment. He in fact wanted to go on and become a submariner when we got the J-class submarines. After World War One, he was part of that flotilla, but when we got out of submarines because we just couldn't afford to keep them going in those post-World War One time, he specialised in navigation and became quite an expert navigator, and navigated a number of the cruises during in the interwar period. Had a lot of service with the Royal Navy, which was fairly typical, and he had a lot of experiences which were atypical. For example, he was a squadron navigator of a cruiser squadron operating in the Mediterranean, doing a blockade work off Palestine. So he became used to dealing with a whole range of different sort of people to achieve an aim. Very well respected, really good sense of judgment, and that I think is something that really came out in this episode.
Peter Shannon, another important figure in this story was Bertram Ballard, who was the Australian government's solicitor in Port Vila in the New Hebrides, a condominium, as you've mentioned, today's Vanuatu. What was he like, and how did he become involved?
Well, he's a very interesting person. Bert was born in Toorak in Melbourne. He Dux of Scotch College, first class honours from Melbourne University, BA LLB, and won the French prize. So very distinguished academic background.
Carlton supporter?
Maybe. He went to the New Hebrides in 1934 as the official Australian government solicitor, which was an odd position, but he was working on conveyancing and real estate issues linked to the Burnsville Trust, which, as I understand it, was a sort of an investment vehicle for people to buy land, and the trust bought land there in Vanuatu, in the New Hebrides. He also did legal work for the Presbyterian Church, so that may have been a kind of factor in why he was there for a long period of time. Henri Sauteau, who was the French resident commissioner, had been there since, I think, 1933, so they must have had a close relationship. But we were being asked by Harry Luke, who was the British High Commissioner for the Western Pacific in Fiji, in end of July, early August of this period, to put somebody on the ground in Noumea. At this stage, the British had an honorary consul called William Johnston, who is a sort of distant relative of my wife, in fact, so I've heard sort of gossips and snippets about him in the course of time. He was the son of a fellow called, I think, Thomas Johnston, who was born in Australia, but had gone to New Caledonia for business purposes, and William was actually born there, but he may have been an Australian citizen, and I'm curious as to why the British had an honorary consul set up there in New Caledonia at the time. I haven't sort of worked that out yet. But he was doing a bit of reporting, and I think he was the Admiralty reporter, Peter.
Yeah, he was.
Presumably reporting back to Australia at the time? I'm not sure about
Yeah,
that.
so the role of the Admiralty reporting officer was a couple of things: reporting on shipping, also things like helping facilitate any Royal Navy ship visits and so on, but really a communications link, if you like. And I guess we can sort of just briefly touch on that, is that the way that they would send things through commercial cable traffic, but they would encrypt it, and so he would do that if he had to provide any updates of matters that Whitehall would want to know. He would be on the ground as the Admiralty reporting officer. So, and that was a known position. And so the foreign government at that time would know that person is the Admiralty reporting officer and has that role.
Well, there was some, as I say, Harry Luke in Fiji was asking that Australia have a representative on the ground. De Gaulle wrote to Sauteau the French resident commissioner in New Hebrides at the time, urging him to consider going to New Caledonia and installing himself there. So I think Canberra realised their information was deficient, so they sent a message to Port Vila asking for Bert to come back to Canberra. He was briefed in Canberra, all in quick time, and then scuttled up to Newcastle and eventually got on board a ship and arrived about mid-August and set himself up. Whereabouts in New Caledonia, I'm not sure. I've been curious to know where the first office was. And then started to report. And when you go through his reporting from the archives, it's quite impressive, very concise, to the point. He subsequently, when he became, I guess, more familiar with the scene there, expressed some cautious criticism of the Australian sort of wait-and-see policy, and thought that it's wearing a bit thin and that action needed to be taken. And I think that report, coupled with some changed views coming out of Harry Luke and Sauteau and Blandy in the New Hebrides, influenced Canberra. Now, who in Canberra? I'm really curious to know how the scene was operating there, certainly external affairs, but what engagement Shannon and the War Cabinet and the Prime Minister and Defence Minister had at the time is still a mystery to me, and I'd like to know more about that.
Okay. Greg Swinden, before Bertram Ballard got to New Caledonia, he had a few alarms and excursions on the way. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it was. He was quite lucky in some respects because he'd made his way up to Newcastle. He was going to board a ship to head across to New Caledonia, but some of his stationery, boxes of equipment, had failed to arrive on time, and so he decided to wait until that equipment turned up. And it's a good thing he did, because the vessel he was due to go to New Caledonia in, the Noumea, after it sailed, was intercepted by one of the German raiders, the Orion, and subsequently captured. So if Ballard had actually joined the Noumea, he would have been captured as well, and more than likely searched, and the Australian government code book that he was carrying at the time confiscated. So he was quite lucky in the failure of the rail system to get his equipment to him on time actually meant that he was delayed in getting to New Caledonia, but that was lucky for Australia.
He wasn't the only one to have a lucky escape. Peter Jones, after Adelaide departed Sydney, she had a lucky escape. Can you tell us about that incident?
Yes, so Adelaide was ordered to go to New Hebrides via Brisbane, where she had to fuel to then make an expeditious passage. So the first night out, she had a head-on collision with the Coptic, which was a larger freighter coming south. And I just need to explain here the scene that all the navigation marks and lighthouses and so on were extinguished, of course, because of the war. Ships were fully darkened, so they didn't have navigation lights. So the way to provide some safety that there weren't collisions like this one was that the southbound traffic would travel inshore, and about 24 miles to seaward of that navigation line, the northbound traffic would proceed. But Harry Showers, because he had to expeditiously get to his destination, sort of essentially cut a corner going up the coast, which crossed that southbound lane. And as it all turned out, they had a near head-on collision. The bridge crew on the Adelaide saw the Coptic about a mile away, and the evasive action they were taking hadn't actually taken hold yet. By the time they'd decided what they're going to do, when they saw this looming ship, the Coptic never saw Adelaide at all. The first thing they heard was this collision. Harry Showers was in his cabin and got knocked out of his bunk, but it was just a glancing blow, as it turned out. But As I say in my book, just a few degrees difference could have been a catastrophic incident, and Adelaide could have been lost.
Just as a brief digression, were there any consequences for Showers and Navigator and indeed the Master of the Coptic as a result of this?
So no, they basically at the time they just stopped, checked that both ships were seaworthy, and then they continued on. After the war, the Commonwealth Government paid the owners of the Coptic £35,000 in damages.
Okay. Peter Shannon, when Adelaide did get to Noumea, to Port Vila, Showers met both the French resident commissioner Henri Sauteau and the British resident commissioner Richard Blandy. What happened at that meeting?
Well, Blandy had just come back from a visit to Noumea and assessed that the majority were positively disposed towards de Gaulle. So that, coupled with reporting that was coming out from Bert Ballard in Noumea at the time too, who was assessing that along the same lines, was I guess persuasive in Canberra about the need to act. However, there had been some additional developments. The French warship, the Dumont d'Urville, had arrived towards the end of August, and on the 29th of August, I guess, the garrison commander, the archives suggest at the pushing of Toussaint de Quievrecourt, the captain in charge of the Dumont d'Urville, losing confidence in Pelissier, the governor at the time, who was prevaricating, and installed the garrison commander, Maurice Denis, to be the new governor, I guess in the hope that he would take a tougher line and be more of a deterrent. Now, so those facts were occurring. Both Sauteau and Blandy, though, argued to Harry Showers that the Free French be advised beforehand if the operation was to go ahead, and that they be advised beforehand. But Canberra hadn't actually taken a final decision about the operation until about the 9th of September. So I guess, which is a bit slow, but when we think about what was going on in Canberra at the time, an election campaign, and don't forget, in the crash at Fairburn, Sir Brunel White, the Chief of the Defence Force, was killed. The Minister for the Army was killed. So there must have been quite a sense of disruption and uncertainty in Canberra to take important decisions like this. So one can understand why Canberra was a little cautious and maybe a bit slow. So during the stay in Port Vila, then more information was coming in, and they felt more confident about embarking on the operation to New Caledonia.
Okay. Greg Swinden, Adelaide left Vila with Henri Sauteau travelling in the Norwegian tanker Norden. What was the role of Norden, and did it have an uneventful passage?
Well, firstly, the decision was made to have Sauteau embarked in Norden because it was not a warship. So there was the opportunity there that when the two vessels arrived at New Caledonia, that the opportunity was allowed, Sauteau could be disembarked from a non-warship, therefore less threatening to those ashore. So they're hedging their bets. You know, they've got a warship that can do the necessary tasks if required, but they've got Sauteau in the Norden, less militaristic, if that's the case. The voyage across was it was not without threat, remembering that a number of German raiders were in the area. Orion had obviously captured No2 only a few weeks before. The location of the Dumont d'Urville was unknown, They later found out she was in port, but she could have been at sea, so there could have been possibly other warships in the area which could have engaged Adelaide on the way. Mm-hmm. So having Sauteau in the merchant ship was less of a risk of him being involved in some form of action. As it was, there was no encounters during the transit, and I know Showers conducted some at-sea firings to test the guns crews, so they arrived safely.
We should recall that at the same time that this is happening, the French and the British are facing off at Mers el Kabir, Oran, and you've mentioned Dakar before, Peter, so it was certainly a tense period of time. Peter Jones, could you describe the Dumont d'Urville and any other opposition that Adelaide might have faced both at sea and ashore when she arrived?
Sure. So as Greg sort of indicated, Dumont d'Urville was a colonial sloop. There was a class of these ships which the French used for really constabulary, good order at sea in the broader French Empire. About 2,000 tonnes, so smaller than Adelaide, 3 5.5-inch guns, and they could carry a seaplane and they could carry some mines as well, and also carry troops. So she'd come from Tahiti. Another ship in the class was the Admiral Shannon, who reportedly was coming from Saigon to New Caledonia, reportedly with 100 troops. I guess the key thing there was that Showers probably wasn't too concerned about if he met one of those ships, but if he met two of them, their guns were pretty much the same range as Adelaide, and if they were able to get on either side of Adelaide and split her fire, well, that could have been challenging for Harry Showers. But as Greg indicated, they didn't really know exactly where these ships were, and really it wasn't until they got to New Caledonia they'd been confirmed where Dumont d'Urville was.
Greg Swinden, the commanding officer of the Dumont d'Urville, we've mentioned a couple of times now, Captain de Quivercor, if I've got that roughly right, Peter. He was an important figure in this story and an interesting character in his own right. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, he was a commander in the French Navy, so one rank lower than Harry Showers, but I don't think that made any concern for de Quivercor. He was very much a career naval officer. He was older than Showers. He'd served during World War I. He came from a long-established French naval family, and he was in a very difficult position because he was bound by duty to do what was required by the government of France. Now, the government of France was now Vichy, so regardless of whether he privately thought that de Gaulle was the way to go, he was bound by being an officer in the French Navy to follow orders from the government of France, which he did. And so he was strengthening, I think, the Vichy cause in New Caledonia. And so he was a significant character there in making sure that the French government was fully represented in that colony. And so over the course of the weeks to come, he and Showers corresponded first by letter and then often in meetings to basically sort out what they were going to do once the Gaullists had taken power, but that's obviously in the future. But certainly he was a man to be reckoned with and not one to give up his duties lightly. Okay.
Peter, Shannon, while Adelaide and Norden are approaching Noumea, what's going on? What's the situation on the ground?
Well, we had mentioned that there was a change of governor at the end of August, and Maurice Denis, the garrison commander, was the new governor. Behind him was de Quivercor. and I think they were genuinely concerned about some sort of uprising. Now, the mood in New Caledonia was largely in favour of the Free French, particularly outside Noumea. The French still call these people Broussards, and a sort of crude translation of that is bushies, but it's a bit unflattering, but they're country folk. And in fact, my wife's immediate family were connected to Broussards, as we call them, Free French types who were agitating in Paita, sort of north of Noumea, for something to be done. In Noumea itself, there were certainly more Pétainiste Vichy types there, particularly among the military families and the civil servants who had come from France. So it wasn't entirely clear, pardon me, as to what might happen. This, I think, spooked the governor a bit, and with information that he got, in fact, from the General Council. You remember Sauteau and Blandy had said that they were going to contact the Free French forces to say that Sauteau was coming. They, in fact, told the governor, who didn't know anything about it, and he was rather shocked, and I think that sort of prompted, on his part, a declaration of a state of siege, whatever that meant in French terms in Noumea, I'm not sure, but the reality was a curfew that was imposed from about 9 o'clock at night. So it was a rather tense situation around the 18th, September as the Adelaide was coming into Noumea.
Okay. We've mentioned communications a couple of times now, and the absence of information driving some sets of decisions. Peter Jones, I'm just wondering if you can describe the actual mechanics of how people communicated and who was communicating with whom.
So really, there was a couple of entities. So there was the Honorary Consul Johnson. So as we indicated, he was the Admiralty reporting officer. His communications was encrypted. He was actually helped by the fact that his wife did the typing and encryption. So his physical ability to write a message, encrypt it, take it to the telegraphic office, get it sent, was much quicker than Bert Ballard, who had to do all that himself. This was fairly new also between the Navy and Defence and Department of External Affairs. And so, for example, Showers was sending his messages to Bert Ballard via the Admiralty. So that could have been a lot smoother. On Adelaide's side, of course, they had a communication centre, and so they had a normal communication setup, which would allow the relatively speedy encryption of signals. But so I think that was probably one of the learnings out of this enterprise, that you needed to have a means where Department of External Affairs and Defence able to communicate in a more direct way.
Okay. Peter, Shannon, just as a quick digression, if I recall correctly, at this stage, Australia had yet to ratify the Statute of Westminster, so we had actually not claimed our ability to conduct our own external affairs. Did that play into the sort of the relative inexperience in terms of international communications like this?
No, I don't think so. I think, as Peter pointed out, it was essentially a logistical problem.
Okay.
No, I don't think that was a factor, and I think there was a mood in external affairs, perhaps, that they were communicating with Stanley Bruce in London at the time, sort of registering a view, and whether it was Bruce and the High Commission people who were sort of, how they were liaising with London, it's not entirely clear. But I think they felt a sense of autonomy, particularly on this issue. I don't think there was any hesitation.
And probably the other thing on the ground, Johnson and Ballard worked closely together and shared information, so that was extremely helpful.
Yeah, and both had an Australian background, as you mentioned.
Greg Swinden, about 6:15 on the morning of the 16th of September, Adelaide and Norden reached the entrance to Noumea Harbour. Can you describe the course of the events over the next couple of hours?
Well, I think the best possible description is confusion. As the vessels arrived, Showers was able to see that there was a Free French flag flying from the pilot station. Normally ships coming into harbour would pick up a pilot to guide them into port, but it was also flying the flag "Do not enter." So there's a confusion there. He decided to push on with the Norden. Next he encounters the guard boat from Dumont d'Urville, basically a small vessel from the French frigate, which questioned why they were coming into port.
Was he aware that Dumont d'Urville was there, or was that the first intimation?
That's the first intimation that he knows it's there. He continues to push on. What they're waiting to see is a vessel, a small boat coming out, flying the Free French flag, throwing over the side empty kerosene tins as a signal that they're here to pick up Sauteau. That vessel doesn't arrive. Now, I've heard two stories. One is that there were some mechanical difficulties, and so the vessel was unable to get into the harbour to undertake that task. The other one, and less auspicious, is that the master of the vessel, his alarm clock didn't go off, so he slept in and therefore didn't get down to the port in time to take the vessel out. Regardless, the vessel that was to pick up Sauteau didn't arrive. Showers decided to push on. He starts to notice that there are more Free French flags flying. Mm-hmm. He still has the order from the pilot station, "Do not enter harbour," but he continues to move into the harbour. He then sights Dumont d'Urville. She's moored, bow out in a Mediterranean moor style, which is, the stern is against the wharf, the bow is facing out. But her guns are unmanned. So she's not presenting a threat to him at that point. So whilst he's waiting for this vessel to turn up to take Sauteau ashore, he's met with, a bit of confusion. One lot is "Do not enter harbour." The guard boat from Dumont d'Urville is there saying "Do not enter harbour," but he can see all of these Free French flags flying in various areas, and the Dumont d'Urville is in a non-threatening position. Also, unbeknown to him at that time, was that the artillery personnel who were manning the guns protecting Noumea had decided to not play a part in the activity. They declared themselves neutral, so they were not going to open fire on Adelaide, so they were not going to support either side. They were just going to sit it out and see how it went. So I think Showers at this point is facing a level of uncertainty, decides that boldness be my friend, and he continues to push on, and let's see what happens.
Peter, Shannon, a foreign warship entering another nation's harbour throws up some diplomatic protocol issues and some international legal issues. Can you talk us through what those might be?
Well, I guess in theory, yes. The practice is that diplomatic approval is sought before the entry of a war vessel. But in this case, of course, theory was somewhat irrelevant because Australia hadn't recognised the Vichy regime. But we had made a gesture, I guess, through Sauteau to advise the sort of popular sounding body in terms of the General Council. So there's an arguable case there that we had paid respect to the sovereignty of the people, at least. But it was all irrelevant, and I think Harry Showers showed extremely good judgment. Whether Canberra was aware of that issue, well, I assume they were, but I think it was just irrelevant to the actual situation on the ground, and all the key players showed good judgment.
Okay. Peter Jones, we've heard that Showers intended to push on was his view shared by Henri Sauteau?
Yes, so I guess the key point here is that initially Sauteau, of course, was in Norden, and one of the reasons Adelaide pushed on was he was concerned the guard boat would put a guard onto Norden and take Sauteau. Once, as Greg described, he could see a lot of Free French support. He then told Norden to go to sea. Sauteau came on board Adelaide, which was actually much better. In fact, he told Sauteau to take off his colonial pith helmet, put on a hard hat, put on a naval helmet. But that meant that they could then talk and then try and judge what is actually happening in this situation, which is still full of ambiguity. So Showers sort of gave Sauteau a little bit of a deadline just for planning and said, look, if we haven't seen anything by 11 o'clock, we'll go back out to sea and I'll take it back to Port Vila. So there was a very tense time where both of them were just sitting on the bridge, just waiting for events. And so the whole thing just hung in the balance. But I guess it's that thing of they were just really judging at the time how things were going. And as time went on, Harry Showers just got more confident that they could carry the day. And then eventually the boat with the Free French flag came out. And also there was the British and the Australian diplomatic key figures came on board Adelaide as well to give their assessment of where things were.
Greg Swinden, as all of this is going on, at 11 o'clock, about the same time as the deadline that Showers had set for the whole thing, the port station signalled Adelaide to enter port. Dumont Deville's been sighted. What's Adelaide actually doing? How's she? Is she just sitting still, or
no?
What's going on?
She's moving, kept moving. She's patrolling the harbour. As you mentioned, suddenly the pilot stations, do not enter harbour flags are removed, and it's you may now enter harbour. The French vessel that they've been expecting for some hours eventually turns up. So it's now the ability to get Sauteau ashore. But Showers decides that he's not going to withdraw over the horizon. He's going to maintain Adelaide in harbour, on the move, continually patrolling through the harbour precinct as a show of force, so that if necessary, her guns can be used, or she can be ready to put a landing party ashore if necessary.
Okay.
So, and Bert Ballard in his papers talk about the fact that Adelaide looked like a caged tiger going up and down the harbour.
Peter Shannon, the French governor, has got a lot of pressure on him. A caged tiger in the harbour, a decidedly mixed situation ashore. Pressure on him from the Vichy government, from the Free French. What's going through his mind, and what does he decide to do?
Well, I mean, he was a military officer, and I think had a real discipline about the way he judged this, and had conflicted loyalties. Clearly, I think they were instinctive in him. But he must have also been aware of that evening of the 18-19 September that hundreds of so-called broussards, people from the countryside, were coming down to Noumea. Now, the governor had set up roadblocks on the key roads coming into Noumea, and my wife's family, in fact, they were vigorously Free French up around Paita, and quite a few dozen broussards had come to his property and they discussed what they should do. They were worried about losing their weapons because of the roadblocks. Now, my wife's great uncle delivered coal and wood down to Noumea on a daily basis almost. So he proposed that they hide the weapons in these bags of coal and wood, and he would take them down to Noumea and they could collect them there. Now this is in fact what he did. So they came through the roadblocks down to Noumea, were joined by up to about 2,000 people. I mean, there were a lot of people out on the street.
Considerable number.
Maurice Denis, he must have been very concerned then that he was going to lose control of the situation, worried about the warship, worried about the safety and security of the pro-Vichy Pétainiste people, and I think that was a very pragmatic sort of factor in his mind then, plus his own instinct to behave in a very sort of dignified, courteous way with another military officer, in this case Harry Showers.
Okay. And when Sauteau went ashore, what sort of reception did he
There
get?
were 2,000 people there, down on the Noumea wharf, which was a large number of people for a relatively small town, and it must have been just a wonderful occasion. They felt liberated, I guess, in a sense. They were confident they could prevail in any confrontation around Noumea with the Pétainiste holdouts, but there were still military people about, and they were certainly better armed than the country folk, despite the arms that my uncle had, my wife's uncle had smuggled into Noumea. So it was still a tense situation.
Okay. The governor eventually did decide to give way, though. How did that process occur?
Well, he did. I don't have quite the specifics at hand to describe it, but he conceded, and presumably under the protection of Toussaint de Quievrecourt and the ship. Sauteau himself, that evening of the 19th, I think, sensed that the situation was a little bit unstable and uncertain, and decided not to stay in Noumea overnight, but stayed outside Noumea, where I'm not sure, until the situation calmed down. And as we know, subsequently there were 2 attempted pushbacks, I won't call them counter-coups or anything like that, by the sort of Vichy Pétainiste, but they were thwarted. The Civil Guard in Noumea had come on side with the Free French, so he felt, I think, that the situation was under control, and presumably Harry Showers, Bert Ballard and Johnston likewise were making those sorts of assessments. But,
it's said that when Sauteau called on Denis, Denis said, I should have you arrested as a traitor. And then when Sauteau dared him to do that, he then said, well, Denis replied, well, how can I do it when you have an 8-inch cruiser in the harbour? So I think he just felt that he didn't have anywhere to go but to give up, and I think he sort of said, well, you can take over the governorship at 3:30 this afternoon.
Okay. Peter Shannon, following the uncertainty overnight, what was the situation the following morning?
Well, it had settled down quite a bit, as I say. There were, in the course of the next few days, some attempted pushback, but essentially the situation had calmed. The Broussard was still about as a sort of voluntary force, I assume, that Sauteau and others felt they could call on if they needed to, but as it turned out, there was no need to.
Okay. Greg Swinden, the Vichy loyalists, what were they doing and what was their situation as this was going on?
That's interesting because de Quievrecourt was the main player in much of this. He'd had some of his sailors ashore armed to maintain the peace. They showed great restraint, but had been jeered by the many crowds and been withdrawn to the ship. De Quievrecourt's main concern, and he discussed this with Harry Showers, was that he realised that New Caledonia was lost to the Vichy cause. It was going to become Free French. So he wasn't going to waste people's lives trying to reverse that situation. So he was most concerned about getting those who were supporters of Vichy out of New Caledonia. He wanted to get his vessel, Dumont d'Urville, properly provisioned and fuelled so that it could leave as well and go to Saigon, French Indochina at that time. So he worked quite hard with Showers to arrange for the protection of the Vichy supporters and for their departure from New Caledonia. There was a vessel, the Pierre Loti, that was made available to them, and Showers had a 15-man guard from Adelaide placed on the wharf next to that vessel as well to basically protect it from any Free French retaliation. And so the plan was those who were supporters of Vichy, as mentioned, military personnel, civil servants, and their families would be embarked in the Pierre Loti and would depart and eventually go to Saigon, and Showers guaranteed their safety as part of that.
Peter Jones, you've commanded a warship. Did Dumont d'Urville have any options other than what they took up?
No, and I think the course of action the commanding officer took was really the only one that he could have. The other piece to the puzzle there also was that he'd learnt that the Admiral Shannon had turned back to Saigon, reputedly had a propeller defect, and so that was the reason it went back. So there was really no hope of any reinforcement. I think the other thing was that he and Showers maintained a very cordial, professional relationship that you do see between navies, and so and I think Sauteau saw that Showers was the best conduit to have these discussions to resolve what was going to happen with Dumont d'Urville, and I think that worked out extremely well. And also there was a degree of faith as well. That the commanding officer was clearly a very proud French naval commanding officer, and so he wanted an exit strategy which preserved that dignity.
Okay.
And certainly, I'll just add there that both officers worked very closely together, and because there was a difference in rank, Showers being a captain and de Crèvecoeur being a commander, de Crèvecoeur initiated the activity by offering to call upon Showers, which is a standard naval practice where the junior officer, regardless of nationality, will call upon the senior officer. So there was that normal way of doing business for naval officers, which both of them found easy to carry out, meant that they could discuss things quite openly and frankly.
One other aspect to that was that Showers was quite assiduous in terms of those discussions were quite well documented in terms of what undertakings were given, and Showers was very keen that any undertakings given were actually followed up and done, and he saw that as a key element of maintaining the trust.
Showers and de Crèvecoeur obviously ensured the naval forces behaved as had been agreed. Did Showers have a concern more broadly than that for how the Gaullists might behave ashore?
So there's probably one bit to say before I can answer that question, is that Sauteau wrote to Crèvecoeur outlining that he should leave and so on. That letter was done with the assistance of Harry Showers. So the undertaking to Dumont d'Urville was actually from the new governor, and so there had been some reports of some retribution against some of the Vichy supporters, and so there was discussion then with I think it was with Johnson and it was with Bert Ballard, about so we need to really nip that in the bud, and what we need to do is to communicate what the governor had undertaken to Dumont D'Urville's commanding officer to the Gawler's committee. And so it was decided amongst those three that actually Harry Showers was the best person to do that. So unusually, Showers went before the Gawler's committee and the council and then explained these are the undertakings that have been done, in relation to the Dumont D'Urville leaving and also the protection of people who had supported the Vichy regime. And that carried considerable weight, and there was an impassioned response back from one of the members, Monsieur Pignon, I think his name was, who said, yes, if the governor has given that undertaking, we will on our honour adhere to that undertaking, make sure that that was done. So that helped preserve the relations between the two sections of the community. And I think at that point also, Showers then thought he was probably out of his comfort zone in terms of doing that action. He then withdrew, and really the only thing that Adelaide did was stay there and provide that guard, as Greg indicated, on the Pierre Loti. Okay. So they just wanted to withdraw from the political machinations.
Peter, perhaps if I could ask a question on this issue, was Harry Showers getting clearance from his superiors in Australia?
There's no evidence of that. So he was really on his own cognizance that he was doing that.
That's interesting.
Adelaide stayed in the vicinity of Noumea in the harbour for a couple of weeks, but by the 5th of October, Peter Shannon, I think Showers had decided that the situation was stable enough for him to sail. What was Sauteau's reaction to this?
Well, Sauteau wrote a very generous letter to Harry Showers, a letter of thanks, but particularly thanking him for resolving this conundrum with the Dumont D'Urville, and was very grateful that the problem, which he couldn't have dealt with, frankly, without the Adelaide being there, was resolved. And interestingly, not long after the 5th, when the Adelaide left, he went on a tour around some of the key towns in the interior of New Caledonia and visited Paita, where my wife's aunt was a young schoolgirl of about 10 or so, and she was selected by the school to thank Sauteau when he visited. And her mother gave her a haircut in the style of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, and she read a poem, and the governor came up and gave her a big hug, and she still remembers that to this day, that their, I guess, courage of the bush people to support de Gaulle so soon in a time of uncertainty had prevailed, and Sauteau had shown himself to be, I think, courageous and well judged in working with Harry Showers and others to bring about a very successful outcome.
Certainly. Greg Swinden, how was this incident received and viewed in Australia and elsewhere?
Certainly, the Australian government was happy that the situation had been resolved so well. The British were very happy that the situation had been resolved. And as previously been mentioned, it wasn't the only French colony around the world that was struggling with whether to be Vichy or whether to free French, and this was a success because of virtually no bloodshed in the entire activity. Unlike Iran and Dakar, and later in Syria, and Madagascar down the track as well in 1942, where they actually in full-scale conflict in order to resolve the situation. And an Australian warship, Australia, was involved in the Dakar event, and she was actually struck by Vichy French shells during that activity. So, in this case, it was a good activity. They succeeded in what needed to be done, and they did that with a minimum of fuss, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, compared with the other activities, particularly in Dakar and Syria later on down the track.
Thank you. Gentlemen, in closing, can I invite each of you to provide some final thoughts on the incident? Peter Jones.
Yeah, I think Harry Showers, in his report of the incident, which was tabled to Cabinet, was very effusive in his commendation for the work of the crew of the ship, but also for the work that Ballard had done, and also for Henry Sauteau, who he thought was a man of great courage. And I just think that the secret to that success of this episode really was how those three key men each had each other's respect, and they were able to navigate themselves through this ambiguity to end up with the outcome that really the people in New Caledonia wanted.
Peter Shannon.
Well, my former DFAT colleague Denise Fisher has written on this subject, and she says that this was the first manifestation of an independent foreign policy action by Australia. I think that's the case. It was a complicated situation in Canberra for the reasons I mentioned earlier, when one can only imagine the stress and strain that was going on here at the moment, as well as an election campaign being prepared and waged. But the players were given autonomy and produced an outcome that was ideal for Australia. Interestingly, John McEwen, who was the foreign minister, and I still haven't quite worked out I haven't gone through the archive sufficiently to see where his fingerprints are on the various decisions that were made. But he says in his memoirs, or people have quoted him as saying, that this event was the most significant event of his political career. So he personally regarded it as an achievement, and I think that reflects in his own calculation that it was complicated and risky, and showed a degree of, determination on the part of the decision makers in Canberra that there were clear Australian interests engaged here, and we were going to pursue them. The events also showed the crucial importance of having information on the ground, and the decision to bring Bert in early August was well founded. They got the right bloke. He spoke excellent French. Knew Sauteau, no doubt had a connection with William Johnston, and his reporting was crucial at key times, particularly in the run-up to the decision in Canberra to go ahead with the operation. So that was important. And I think finally the flexibility and judgment of the key players, Harry Showers in particular, I think in that very difficult moment of negotiating with Toussaint de Kiev-Recourt and getting the Vichy Pétainiste out of the country was admirable.
Thank you. Greg Swinden.
I think it is a classic situation of the flexibility of naval forces. So the ability to do the diplomatic role, the constabulary role and the military role, and quickly change from one activity to another. So obviously, Adelaide goes there, Showers does quite well in the diplomatic role, the crew do very well. At one point they march through the streets of Noumea. There's a guard with rifles and bayonets fixed, but the band's playing. And then they go to the War Memorial and there's a ceremony there. So showing that diplomatic side of the ability of naval forces. But then if things had gone badly, thankfully they didn't, but if they had gone badly, then it could turn very, very quickly to a military activity, and that's where Adelaide's 6-inch guns could have been used against Dumont D'Urville. They could have put a landing party ashore of in excess of 100 men to deal with some of the Vichy supporters. It didn't come to that, but it was they were carrying the big stick, but they were talking softly.
Peter Jones, Peter Shannon, Greg Swinden, thank you for sharing the fruits of your knowledge and your research. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you return for other great stories about Australian naval history. You can find this one and others by searching for Naval Studies Group in your podcast app. Thank you.